Very welcome to this seminar. We got the idea well, there's a lot of serious discussions and and developments about ceasefire, about other things taking place in Rafah and whatever. And this is, of course, serious. But there's also a broader context. How is the impact of all this going on in Gaza and Israel for the broader, especially maybe Arab Middle East and, of course, Iran? So that what we wanted to address in this seminar. And I'm happy that so many showed up in this sunny day. And then I will give the word to Sune to explore a little bit about this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lars. Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Sune Haugbølle. I'm from Roskilde University. I'm sort of organizing this with Lars and Mona and Christine and Dalia, who came from Lund. Mona will lead the proceedings, and she will introduce us as we speak. But I just want to say a couple of things about why we're here today and what the point is of this seminar. So I think we're all following what's going on, and I think all of us in the room are very concerned and probably sort of sad, but also curious about what's happening almost on a daily basis. But we wanted to take an opportunity now, 7 months after the war broke out. Sorry, I forgot to mention Rasmus, who's also speaking, but you'll be introduced in a second. We wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the broader implications for the Middle East. So at the level of alliances, of tendencies in thought and politics, if you want. So I think one thing we're really seeing is deep divisions in Middle Eastern politics, in Arab politics, but also in Arab societies. Not everyone agrees on, first of all, how to interpret what's going on, and secondly, what the Arab states and what the other states in the region and what the world powers should do in reaction to this. And of course, the war is still going on. We're not at a liberty to say this has been a victory for Hamas or a victory for Israel. Most of all, it's been a defeat for everyone. But there have been big changes to the Middle East already, and we wanted to create a space to discuss that with each other and with you. So hopefully we'll have some good time for a discussion and debate afterwards as well. I think on the level of ideas, which is what I'm going to be talking about in my presentation, I think there's certainly broader conflicts in the world that are sort of reflected in the Gaza war. One is a north-south conflict, a global south, global north conflict. I think there's also elements of a generational conflict in how people are reacting to the war, and we see that with the campus protests and tents and all this right now. There's a debate also about democratic deficit in the region, which is showing very clearly. You have regimes who have a hard time reacting to what's going on, while their populations are actually very upset, and how to find a place for them to give voice to that. And then I think there's something interesting about the situation of the world right now with former colonies and their former colonial masters being in a very uneasy kind of relation, where you could read Gaza as being really on the front line of this. So we wanted to bring some of that up, and it's going to come with different angles here in the different presentations. We're not going to do long presentations. We're going to do fairly short and to the point presentations, and then have some, right, Mona? Yeah.
Exactly.
And then have some good debate afterwards. So thanks for coming, and I look forward to it.
Thank you, Sune. And my name is Mona Kanwal Sheikh, and I'm a senior researcher here at the Danish Institute for International Studies and head of the Global Security and Worldviews Unit. And I'm also very happy to welcome you all here. I will be moderating this event. So just a few words about the game plan, which is basically, we will have 5 presentations, precisely time-managed presentations, like 10 to 15 minutes each, and we will have them in a row, and then afterwards we will open up for questions and answers, and the panelists will also have a chance to comment on each other's presentation. So as Sune said, you have probably noticed the game or the idea behind the seminar, as Lars also said, is to zoom out a bit and look at the implications of the unfolding situation in Gaza for the wider region, but also for the rule-based order, as Lars will talk about, but also for public discourses about how we talk about the conflict, how the conflict is represented. So we hope to be able to leave from here at 5 o'clock with a better sense of, first of all, where, what is the situation in the Middle East? Where does the Arab state stand in relation to Israel? How is this conflict discussed, particularly in the Arab world, in Arab media, in Iranian media, and what are the debates that concern, the local populations in that region, and not least, how is the situation discussed among intellectuals in the region? So I'm really happy to have the chance to moderate this event, and I hope that we will get good discussions and debates out of this in order to enlighten ourselves and each other. The seminar is live streamed, just so you know. So welcome also to potential listeners that we can't see out there. And I don't know how many is following this event, but it's always a pleasure to have these open events also. So our first speaker is Dalia, Dr. Dalia Kaye. Am I pronouncing it right? Yeah. Who's a senior fellow at the UCLA and is also a Fulbright Schumann visiting scholar at the Center for Advanced Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University in Sweden. And Dr. Dalia has written dozens of academic articles. She has written 2 books, done a lot of policy work and policy studies, and is a frequent public speaker, contributing to leading media outlets, for instance, Foreign Affairs and so on. So welcome, and you will be speaking under the headline of a regional reset after Gaza or back to the future.
Okay, thank you. Oh, excuse me. Okay. Okay, thank you, Mona and Sune and Lars, for inviting me out to beautiful Copenhagen. I spent many years at a research institute also near the water with also lots of sun in California. So I'm feeling very much at home today, so it's wonderful to be here. So I'm going to be focusing, I really think it's so important the organizers are thinking about this idea of zooming out, and I'm really looking forward to the other presentations today. And as we said, I will be very short, but what I'm going to focus on in these few minutes is looking at the broader extent to which the war in Gaza has or has not changed some of the regional trend lines, and these aren't the only trend lines, of course, but I'm going to outline a few and assess how much has really changed in terms of where things were headed, where things are going. Now, there's no dispute that the Gaza war has touched every corner of this region. In fact, it's touched every corner of our world. It has been and will be transformational when it comes to Israel, when it comes to Palestinians, when it comes to their very uncertain future. And it really has. I give lots of talks on the regional spillover of this conflict, and we all talk about containing the war, but there's a good argument to be made that it already is a regional war. If you look at all the fronts and all of the hot spots, this is not a normal situation. But again, it is not clear that the war, and I think, hopefully in the 10 or 15 minutes I will convince you of this, but we'll have Q&A where you can push back, that despite that, it's not really clear that it has been a game changer in terms of some of the broader trend lines, and that's for better or for worse. So I'm going to look at 4 very briefly trend lines. One being Arab-Iranian rapprochement, the second being intra-Arab reconciliation, the third being diminishing U.S. influence in the region, and finally, the one that would be, you'd think, most challenging in terms of whether things have changed or not, which is Arab-Israeli normalization, which gets, I don't know about here in Denmark, but in the U.S., a lot of attention, maybe more attention than warranted, but a lot. So starting with Arab-Iranian normalization or rapprochement. Now, seems like a very, I'm understanding, well-informed audience. So for all of these trends, I'll give you the very, very quickest background to where we stood before October 7th and where things are standing now. But as we know, there's been a very long history of fraught ties between Iran and the neighborhood, particularly Gulf Arab states, and between Iran and Saudi Arabia especially. Relations really went downhill in 2016. That's when we had a very big break, when the Saudis cut ties with the Iranians, when their embassy was attacked in Tehran. This was during protest over the Saudi execution of a Shia leader. And then we had years of very, very tense relations between the Saudis and the Iranians that followed. This coincided with the Trump administration having a very, very strong anti-Iranian disposition, a very pro-Saudi disposition. President Trump's first visit to anywhere in the world was to Saudi Arabia. That was the Orbs and Swords summit. I hesitant to recall all of these things, but such as that is. And so this is a time of very, very extreme anti-Iran sentiment. You have the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018. So very, very tense time, and that very much illustrated and represented itself in this split between the Iranians and the Saudis during this time. However, after about a year of so-called strategic, Rasmus, I guess you're going to talk about Iran more, but what a lot of people, Iran watchers, call strategic patience after the U.S. left the Iran deal. By a year later, the Iranians ran out of strategic patience and moved into facing maximum pressure from the United States to their own maximum resistance against Washington and this kind of sanctions regime that was being imposed upon them. And they started lashing out, and they lashed out in the neighborhood. And they started hitting oil facilities, specifically Saudi Aramco, in 2019. And the U.S. did not respond to that. This is when the neighborhood, this is a very, very short version of events, but this is when the neighborhood kind of woke up and said, I guess we're not going to be counting on Washington to come to our defense, and we are Iran's neighbors. Iran isn't going anywhere. Maybe this idea of this big confrontation with the Iranians wasn't such a great idea. Let's try to ratchet down the pressure. And the Emiratis actually led the way. They normalized ties or resumed ties with the Iranians in 2021, and the Saudis most significantly followed with great fanfare in a Chinese-brokered big diplomatic agreement in just a year ago, 2023. So that's what we saw happening that was leading up to the very horrific events of this year. Now, I would argue, and I think what we're seeing, and all of this is to be determined because we're still very much at play here, but we are actually seeing not only that this trend line of rapprochement is not reversing, it seems to be accelerating. So you had, for example, President Raisi, the Iranian president, attending a very rare summit of the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation a month after the Gaza attacks in October and November. First visit, I believe, of an Iranian president in about a decade to Saudi Arabia. The following month, Saudi and Iranian leaders were meeting again in Beijing to discuss relations. You had the Iranian and Saudi foreign minister meeting in Davos over the winter. And then I think it was just last week, the Iranians probably a little too confidently, but put on a big civilian nuclear cooperation conference in Isfahan, which is the city with the Israelis had just attacked, which happens to be where a lot of their nuclear facilities are based. And they put on a big conference, and the Saudi ambassador and other Saudi officials attended that conference, and they even put out a communique suggesting the Iranians and Saudis would be engaging in future nuclear civilian cooperation. So the bottom line is the Gaza war has not altered that trend line of warming ties, not perfect, still a fraught relationship with lots of differences. That's an understatement. But that warming trend, that de-escalation trend between the Saudis and the Iranians seems to be continuing. Second one would be the intra-Arab reconciliation. We had a big breaking up. Of course, the Arab world is incredibly diverse. There's no monolithic camp in any part of the region, but there was extreme fracturing during the Arab Spring years, where you had these devastating civil wars, Arab states fighting each other through proxies, great ideological divides, especially focused on the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, most dramatically represented with the blockade of Qatar in 2017 by the Saudi Emirati-led camp. So tremendous fracturing of the Arab neighborhood. And again, you see kind of a similar, for different reasons, but a desire to start ramping down these tensions, understanding that everybody has their own domestic agendas. These wars are, you would have thought they would have thought that ahead of time, but unfortunately not. After a lot of bloodshed, came to this conclusion that wars were not good for business, wars were not good for development, they were not good for agendas at home. So you saw another rapprochement developing in 2021 between within the Gulf and the broader region. Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE ended their blockade, and you also saw to the dismay of many, but this is the reality of where things were standing before October 7th, which is the normalization of the Bashar al-Assad regime, where they were, Syria under Assad was welcomed back. I don't know about welcome, but accepted back to the Arab League in 2023. So all of these things were happening before October 7th. And again, interestingly, the resilience of some of these thawing trends is remarkable. I mean, you could argue with such an upheaval happening, you would think that there would be pressures against some of these trends. But again, we are seeing actually more coordination, more unity among otherwise quite, states with quite differing ideological and political agendas. And what we're seeing is Palestine tends to be a very unifying force. There is a sense for different reasons, and I think others will speak to this better than me, I'm looking forward to learning more about what is driving this, but it's very interesting. And so we're seeing a very interesting set of coordination happening among Arab states and Arab powers, as well as between Arab states and Turkey, who were also at odds, I should add, for a number of years. The third trend, moving very quickly to keep to our timeline, I think I'm getting there. We started 5 minutes late, so I think I'm there, which is the one that's close to where I follow very closely as an American, of course, U.S. policy in the Middle East. Not the most optimistic topic, but we have seen this trend line, and this is across Democratic and Republican administrations, frankly, where there is this sense of we've had enough of the Middle East after the Afghanistan and Iraq wars and insurgencies, and there was not a lot of appetite for continuing to invest in this region. And so across multiple administrations, there was a sense that we need to shift to geostrategic competition with China. We need to pivot to Asia. This region is sinking us, getting us kind of sunk in. And there was a perception in the region itself that the U.S. was leaving, right? You had a lot of reluctance during the Obama administration to intervene in Syria and the other civil wars beyond Libya. Some say maybe that's for the best. That could be. That's another argument. But that's the perception and the reality that the U.S. was not eager to intervene again. You had the non-response during the Trump administration to the Aramco attacks. And then you have during the Biden administration's very first year, one of the first acts of the Biden administration is to withdraw from Afghanistan. Regardless of the chaos that followed, he stuck to kind of that campaign promise. And Afghanistan's not the Middle East proper, but the perception is that's kind of where the U.S. is headed. Now, my own view, and this is based on a lot of empirical fact, is the U.S. never really left the Middle East. It's more of a perception than a reality. It depends on where your baseline is. It was always very skewed because the U.S. presence in the Middle East was ahistorically extreme following 9/11. We had never had that kind of force presence in the Middle East traditionally. In the 1970s, it's like 2% of U.S. forces globally were in the Middle East. After 9/11, it was over 50%. So everything got consumed by the Middle East after 9/11. But that's not the norm. And so if you base it on that, then yes, it looks like the U.S. is leaving. We only have tens of thousands of U.S. troops, not hundreds of thousands. So yeah, but let's just say we have a lot of force presence still in the region and major military bases and major political and security relationships with the region. The U.S. is still the largest arms supplier in the Middle East. So it's not like the U.S. is exactly leaving, but the perception is still very much there. Now, when Gaza broke out, there was this sense that, maybe the U.S. is back. The Biden administration made this very early decision to send 2 aircraft carriers to the region to kind of message to Iran. If you're thinking about getting involved in this war, don't. That's how Biden put it. And we can debate whether that worked or not. But people who in Washington didn't love the idea of the U.S. going out of the Middle East or kind of retrenching, or those in the region who wanted very much the United States to stay in, were kind of excited by this. They thought, okay, this is good news. The U.S. is back. We're going to call the shots again. We're not going to be so distracted. I think that's also quite a mischaracterization of what's really happening. I think this perception that the U.S. Still is not calling all the shots. China is still very much a force economically. And the U.S. posture of backing Israel unequivocally has burned many bridges in the region and diminished U.S. credibility and, if not, influence. So I think this trend line of kind of U.S. losing some of its staying power with all of the nuance is still very much at play. And then finally, Arab-Israeli normalization. This would be the trend line you would think would be most disrupted by Gaza, given the incredible popular viewpoint that normalization is wrong and most populations are opposed to normalization. But you are not seeing the UAE or Bahrain formally breaking ties. They're getting a lot more scrutiny. They're being more careful. And others like Jordan, Turkey are taking a harder stand, but Jordan still has a peace treaty. Egypt still has a peace treaty, even though they're making very tough statements. It's not kind of, unraveling, but I would argue it only looks like it would take a blow if you had very unrealistic expectations about the Abraham Accords to begin with. And I think that's part of the problem, which is the Abraham Accords were really hyped to a degree that wasn't realistic. They weren't bringing peace to the Middle East. As Yitzhak Rabin said, you make peace with your enemies, not your friends. Saudi Arabia and Israel are not fighting wars anymore. Arab states and Israel are not fighting wars anymore. The wars in the region are between Israel and the Palestinians. There was no way to ignore that issue, but those Accords put it in the back burner. So in that sense, I don't think things have changed that much, because not only are they surviving, but the idea that this is going to kind of be the silver bullet to bring peace to the Middle East was never realistic then, and it is most definitely not realistic after October 7th. So in conclusion, I think that, some of the positive, so-called positive trend lines in the region are actually pretty resilient. But the stability, so-called stability that we had before October 7th, I think we need to recognize that also came at the expense of accountability and democracy and governance issues. And in that sense, the consolidation of authoritarianism in the region also has not changed. And so the trend lines are very, very I think, deeply ingrained in the region despite this very traumatic event. And sometimes those trend lines look good and sometimes not as good. But for better or worse, I would argue there's much more continuity than we might have expected, given this real earthquake that we have seen this last year. So I will end with that kind of provocative point, and we can debate it later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will continue to our next speaker, and now we have Dr. Christine Crone, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Cross-Cultural and Regional Studies, and she has written a PhD on particularly Pan-Arab TV, and this TV station, Al-Mayadeen, and she deals with Arab media with a particular focus on Syria and images. And I believe you have also followed the situation on Gaza closely and how it has been portrayed in Arab media.
Yes, that's the idea. Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about how Gaza has been covered and discussed on Arab TV. And Arab TV is a very broad concept, so I will be using the example of two pan-Arab news stations. So they are not talking to a national audience, but to a broader Arab audience. And I'll be using Al Jazeera, which I guess most of you know, and then Al Mayadeen, which is probably a little less known, as examples of how Gaza appears on TV in an Arab context. So before I go into the content of the reporting, I think it's very important to highlight that it's difficult, or it is difficult to report on what's going on inside Gaza. First of all, because it's dangerous. It's the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist at the moment. Since October 7, 1992, Palestinian journalists have been killed. 3 Lebanese and 2 Israeli journalists or media workers have been killed. So that's one very serious obstacle to cover events. Another obstacle is that Israel has closed off Gaza for international journalists. So we all have to rely on the journalists that were already based inside Gaza before 7 of October. Yeah. So that's another fact. But both Al Mayadeen and Al Jazeera had their journalists inside Gaza. So they are in that privileged situation that they can actually report from inside Gaza. Yeah. A third obstacle is that Israel is starting to close down these medias who are reporting from inside Gaza. They started by closing down for Al Mayadeen, that's back in November 23, and not so long ago, I think it's 10 days ago, they closed down for Al Jazeera. And of course they can't close down completely, but they can close down for the stations to operate inside Israel, inside occupied Palestine, on the West Bank. And they can close down the signal in Israel, so Israelis cannot watch the stations. It's not a complete close down. You can enter them if you really want, but it's a more complicated situation than if it was allowed to watch it. Yeah, I just want to get my water here. So in spite of this, Gaza is still being covered 24 hours every day. So in Danish news, what's happening in Gaza has already, reached, you have to scroll down on the websites of different media before you find something about what's happening in Gaza. This is not the situation in Arab media, and especially not in Al Jazeera and Al Mayadeen. Yeah, so I just want to say a few words about these two stations so we all know a little bit about them. So I guess Al Jazeera is known, as I said before, to most of us. It was launched back in 96 by the Emir of Qatar. And the idea was to give Qatar some more political influence, you could say, by having a TV channel that would operate completely in a new way, if you look into what was normal at that time in Arab media, by being a critical news station. So it would cover all Arab states with a very critical angle, except of course Qatar, which was kind of the red line of how critical the station could be and still can be. But it has managed to get Qatar into diplomatic problems with almost all Arab states, as well as the United States. So it's in that way quite. It has been provocative and daring, if you can say that. It has also managed to somehow bring the Arab media audience together, watching the same TV programs, and that also means watching the same coverage of what is happening in Palestine. And because they introduce live coverage, they would also be covering from the West Banks or from Gaza. For example, during the second Intifada, suddenly viewers in the Arab world could actually see what was happening in Palestine in another way than they could before. So it is an important TV station in many ways, but also in how to cover Palestine or bringing the story of what's happening inside Palestine out to a pan-Arab audience. Al Mayadeen was launched back in 2012. It's based in Beirut, but probably funded by Iran. It's not completely clear. It's actually a little blurry. But my best guess would be that it's Iran that are providing the needed funds for this TV station. And that it's placed in Lebanon could kind of back that, as that is also where Hezbollah is placed, and that's the Iranian link there. All right. When Al Mayadeen was launched, it was with an ambition of countering Al Jazeera. Because at that time, 2012, it's just after the uprisings, or in the middle of the uprising, when some of the uprisings were turning into wars. Al Mayadeen was frustrated about, or the people behind Al Mayadeen were frustrated about the way Al Jazeera was encouraging these uprisings in their reportings. So a big aim for Al Mayadeen was to take away the attention of these uprisings, which was mainly to take away the attention of the uprisings in Syria, and kind of put that story away and rather focus on Bashar al-Assad being a great leader, because at that time, that was when he was in power in the good old days, which he still is, but they were fearing that he wouldn't stay there. At least Syria was a country where there was safety, if you could put it that way. Yeah. All right. So what they wanted, Al Mayadeen, was to bring back the focus on Palestine. So they would look at the Arab uprisings as a Western conspiracy aiming at bringing chaos and fragmentation and instability to the Arab world. So they came into the scene saying, we need to bring back the attention to Palestine. All this thing about uprising, it's just a lie. Let's stay with the important stuff, and that is the struggle for a free Palestine. So in that way, both stations has Palestine very close to their agenda. Yeah. So now I'll just try to present some of the themes which has been most prominent in the last months. Yeah. So first of all, there is the destruction and suffering. And I think when you have a journalist based inside Gaza, you can't ignore or avoid this. As you can see here, this is a clip I have taken from Al Jazeera, where they have a cameraman and a journalist standing in a hotel, not in a hotel, in a hospital, sorry, in a hospital, waiting for the victims to arrive, and they will be filming. It's often quite horrible images that is coming out in this way. And here, it's a journalist from Al Mayadeen that is reporting, and he is showing this video about a small child that is being digged out from under a building, a bombed building. Yeah, so by having the journalist based inside Gaza, the images that are coming out are very graphic, very intense, and very close-up suffering that you can show in this way. For both of the channels, it's dominant, but I would say Al Jazeera is probably spending more time on showing the suffering of the people inside Gaza. Yeah. This is just this is something which has come the last weeks, I would say. It has come to take more and more time and space in the covering on both stations, and that's the protest in the US and in Europe. So first of all, there's a narrative about how the students, actually around the world, it could also be in the other day there was a report about students in Japan demonstrating for a free Palestine. But the main focus is on the students in the US. And not only that the world is supporting the Palestinian cause, but also how governments are hitting or trying to stop these protests. So this is Al Mayadeen that is reporting from the Netherlands about how the police is closing down as students sit in at the University of Amsterdam. So the way that governments are working against the people standing with Palestine is also being covered quite intensively. Yeah. So these are two topics that are dominant, but of course the main thing is the war itself. And these are images, all of them are from Al Jazeera, and I think an image like this up here kind of demonstrates that this is a war. In a Danish media context, that would be the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we're used to having these analyses of what is the military strategy here and how is the battlefield developing and so on. But at Al Jazeera, it's exactly the same, but here it's how are the fronts moving in Gaza. Oh, I don't know if it's exactly the same, but it's the same approach to understand how the fronts are moving. At the same time, we have Israel. The Israeli perspective is somehow represented. It's in a very critical way, but nevertheless it's there. And that could be a live coverage from an Israeli press conference, for example. Just as Al Jazeera is also, it's a very bad image, I'm sorry, but I wanted to have one image that could show that they're also using the footage that is coming out of the Israeli defense forces. So they will use that as well to show what the Israelis are showing. Yeah, but what they use quite a lot, of course they use their own material, but what they also use quite a lot is material, and you can't see that, but here there's, because of the light, but here is the logo of Al-Aqsa TV, which is Hamas TV station. So they also use that footage quite a lot. And you can see photos like these up here would also be Hamas who are producing these kind of images, and Al Jazeera that are using them, and yeah. So at Al Mayadeen it's also a war, but it's slightly different it's slightly different in the way, for example, that Israel is present, yes, but the interesting thing here would be stories about the Israeli the losses, the defeats, the things that didn't work out. So it's usually crying soldiers or soldiers that are being buried. There are also maps that shows the war and how the positionings are moving, but it's it's a little less focused on the strategies, if you could put it like that. But still, there will be some reportings about how things are developing. Again, we have here we see that journalist inside Gaza, and he's showing some of the footage from Al-Aqsa TV, the same as they were using, not the same footage here, but the same TV channel as Al Jazeera is also getting footage from. And sometimes Al Jazeera and Al Mayadeen can even use the same footage. So they are both sending quite a lot of material that they get from Hamas's TV station. This is another example here. What Al Mayadeen is doing, which Al Jazeera is doing less, is the focus on what's going on the border between Lebanon and Israel. And that's of course because Hezbollah is placed up here. So who Israel will confront in the border to Lebanon is of interest to a channel like Al Mayadeen. I just want to say one short thing, and then I will round off. It's my last slide. I think that the main difference, if I have to make a comparison, which, well, I wasn't asked to, but I'll try anyway, is that at Al Jazeera, which are these 3 photos here, you can see the Al Jazeera logo. This is very much a war between Hamas, which somehow also becomes Palestine, but Palestine/Hamas against Israel. Whereas at Al Mayadeen, this is seen as a bigger conflict. This is one front out of several fronts. And they will show images like this to show, okay, what is happening on the other fronts? Well, this is Hezbollah's flag. Al-Manar, that's the TV station. This is Hezbollah's flag. This is representing what is the opposition groups in Iraq that will support the cause. And this is the Yemeni flag, so it's what's going on there. So they have several fronts, and what is going on in Gaza is just one out of several fronts where it will be a struggle against Western imperialism. So the struggle against Israel and Palestine is one out of several examples of this struggle. Yes?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
So we will rush. Let's give Christine a hand. Yeah.
I don't know how to take the...
No, I think we will fix it. Yeah. So our next speaker is Dr. Rasmus Elling, who is Associate Professor of Iranian Studies and Head of the Middle East Studies at the University of Copenhagen. And he has written extensively on particularly Iran, both in academic publications and in Danish and international media. And you are currently working on a large project about Iran and beyond Iran, diasporic politics, transnational entanglement, and digital publics. Looking at, for instance, geopolitics, the geopolitics of resistance against Iran in countries such as Denmark, the UK, and France.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and thank you for the invitation. I will try to raise a number of points for discussion, sprinkled with some anecdotes and perspectives that hopefully can be interesting as a supplement to the wonderful presentations we've already heard. So the first one pertains to this question of Iran being strong abroad but weak at home. I will return to the second half of that towards the end. First of all, there's the fact that Iran is very much present. We've already heard this. We've seen this several times. Iran is present in perhaps in an unprecedented way across the region. With a military presence or a semi-military presence, perhaps only comparable to what the Shah used to have in the 1970s when he engaged the Iranian army in battling communist insurgencies in Oman and so on. So there's the fact that Iran is present, and then there's the perception that Iran is strong. And I want to make a distinction here. Perhaps the most spectacular evidence or example of this was the so-called Operation True Promise on April 14, when Iran launched an unprecedented, indeed historically unprecedented attack on Israel with hundreds of missiles and drones. It was an attack that frankly came as a surprise, I believe, to the scale and nature of the attack came as a surprise to many observers of the region and military experts as well. It was, of course, a response, seen with Iranian eyes, to another unprecedented attack, namely the Israeli attack on Iran's consular/intelligence center in Damascus in Syria on April the 1st. So we were anticipating a kind of a retaliation, but nothing of the magnitude that we saw. But also, it was an attack that seemed extremely well calibrated as a spectacle that should surprise us and overwhelm us and sort of present Iran as a very powerful actor in the region, but at the same time not really hitting its targets. Whether that is down to the support that Israel got from its allies in a very quick and rapid manner, or whether it's down to Iranian incompetence, or whether it's down to the calibration of this attack to minimize at least civilian casualties and to sort of try and control the attack in a way that Israel on the day after would have an off-ramp and not necessarily having to further escalate the situation. That has generated, of course, a lot of debate in Iran, and I was invited to talk a little bit about discussions in Iran, which I can unfortunately only follow from afar in digital public spheres and in Iranian media, and of course in conversations with colleagues around the world following Iran closely. There's a lot of discussion about whether this was actually the show of force that the regime insists it is. Certainly the core loyalist sort of audience in Iran bought the story that Iran had hit back very hard and in a spectacular manner and re-established its deterrence. But there is also the extremists in Iran who had wished for more. And there are also those who had wished that Iran hadn't even gone down that road. They are rarely given a voice in Iran. Recently, one of the only official voices left, rather, the political scientist Sadegh Ziba-Kalam, he was arrested a week ago on a way to launch of his own book entitled "Why Are You Never Arrested?" He was actually arrested. He was one of the few people who tried officially on Iranian TV to talk against this sort of escalatory process that Iran has embarked on. So Iranian regional influence has been growing for quite some time with some setbacks, namely some resistance, for example, in Iraq, where there have been public protests against Iranian influence before 7th of October, and other setbacks in the region, and also with some uneasy relationships with their so-called Axis partners. But there's no doubt that Iranian influence has grown significantly since 7th of October. Of course, the strongest links are with the historic partners in Hezbollah in Syria, the Shiite militias in Iraq, and the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah in Lebanon, of course. There's also considerable links mentioned here to the Houthis in Yemen. And in recent years, there's a long history of Iranian support for Palestine, a long, complicated history, let's put it that way. But there's no doubt that in the last couple of years, Iran has ramped up its financial, logistical, and military support for Hamas and Islamic Jihad specifically. So October the 7th presented a new and rare opportunity for Iran to cement this very loose network called the Axis into a tighter, more tightly coordinated network. I'm still not calling it an alliance. I think there's a lot of things missing until you can call it an alliance, but certainly it's a stated official strategy now to unite the fronts, as they call it in Iran, to sort of gain a larger sense of coherence between these different actors across the region that Iran is presenting as their allies. And there's no doubt that there's a perception among the states in the region that Iran is infiltrating a lot of spheres. Just today there was this news coming out from Jordan that they had discovered a plot whereby Iranians had smuggled weapons into Jordan and helping opponents of the monarchy there, as just one example. I will return to the weak at home argument in a moment and then raise a second point for discussion, which is the nuclear issue. So, as we heard, Trump pulled out the U.S. of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action on the nuclear deal in 2017-2018, which basically meant the death of the nuclear deal, and the introduction also of a new kind of very severe sanctions that has destroyed many sections of Iranian economy, or at least halted Iranian economy. It seems that again, Iranian economy is slowly resurfacing and adjusting to this new reality, or not so new anymore. But what is a fact is that Trump's decision completely destroyed decades of diplomatic work and effectively moved the carrot supposed to entice Iran to comply with Western demands for scaling back its uranium enrichment program. So, in other words, sanctions relief and the reintegration of Iran into the World Economic Forums dominated by Western powers. At the same time, the US may have scaled back its presence in the region, or rather there's a perception that the US has scaled back its presence in the region, which to some extent have removed or recalibrated the stick. So we both have the traditional, the historical carrot missing now, and also the stick. In other words, what is holding Iran back from actually developing a nuclear weapon? And this is something that is being debated now in Iran for the first time. And this is a changing of the public debate in Iran that we've seen over the last couple of months, following the Israeli counterattack on Esfahan that has been mentioned. There was a Revolutionary Guard commander who came out and said, and I quote here the translation, "It is possible to review the nuclear doctrine and policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran and deviate from the previous considerations." And this is a reference to the fact that, or it's reference to the idea that Ayatollah Khamenei has issued, perhaps, a fatwa against the development, storing, and usage of nuclear weapons. And I'm stressing the idea that, because there's actually debate on whether those mentions are to be considered as a fatwa, and in that case, are they to be considered more than a fatwa, an actual state policy? But Khamenei has said numerous times that Iran is not going to develop a nuclear weapon because it's against Islam. But now it's being debated by revolutionary commanders, and also a member of parliament who followed up on these comments and indicated that, and I quote here, "If permission is issued, there will be only a week before the first nuclear test." There's completely new rhetoric coming out of Iran. Later, he even added, this MP, that maybe it's not unthinkable that we revisit the nuclear fatwa. In other words, that all of these are signaling a change to the objective of the nuclear program in Iran. Of course, the MP was quickly rebuked and reprimanded, both by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran, saying nothing has changed on this point. We stick to this religious decree that Iran is not going to develop any nuclear weapons. There's no change to the doctrine or to the fatwa, and this talk is actually only benefiting the enemies of the Islamic Republic. They will introduce more sanctions if you talk like this in the public debate. But nonetheless, the boundaries have been pushed in Iran. They're openly discussing now whether Iran should pursue a nuclear weapon. And the fact is that as long as there's Israeli-Iranian animosity, and as long as Israel is armed with nuclear weapons, which is a fact that we rarely discuss, the region will appear insecure for an Iran under the Islamic Republic, and there will be sort of calls for perhaps developing Iran beyond its current status as a threshold power, which can potentially develop nuclear weapons, to one that actually has nuclear weapons. So my third point for debate is the idea of being forever alone. Sounds slightly tragic, but it is a strong, deep sense, historically contextualized in Iran, that Iran stands alone. It is correct that Iran has developed its tie to China. It is correct that Iran has developed its ties to Russia. It's correct that there is a kind of a normalization or détente or a rapprochement with the Arab states. It's correct that the front of the axis looks stronger today, but it's also a fact that all of these relations are have been developed in a less than optimal situation of maximum pressure from the West, and they have been alternative to developing actual real allies. Iran doesn't have any allies, and the Islamic Republic is painfully aware that nobody will come to their rescue if there is an actual war, or very few people will come to their rescue, and what they actually can bring to the table is doubtable. So this, I think, we should keep in mind. The final point is being weak at home, and touches upon this question of perception versus reality. Let's look at the latest parliamentary elections in Iran. It was a historic defeat for the Islamic Republic. Only 40% turnout in the first round. That's the lowest ever since the Islamic Republic was established after the Iranian Revolution in '79. In the runoff election that was just held a couple of days ago, only 8% of the voters in Tehran participated. This is the lowest ever turnout in any election ever in the Islamic Republic. And even at a time when Ayatollah Khamenei was practically begging people to vote. It's a historic defeat. in an election that it itself is heavily rigged in favor of the Khamenei loyalist from the conservative camp, with absolutely no meaningful opposition whatsoever, no reformists, no moderates in sight. And it's a stark contrast to the time when there were so-called moderates in Iranian politics, when turnout would often reach 70% or even 80% for presidential elections. Only 48% turned out for the presidential elections in 2021 that brought the current president to power. So the Islamic Republic is facing a deep, significant crisis of legitimacy. There's no doubt about that. And it's further compounded by the fact that Iran was rocked by a year almost of intense public protests under the Zan Zendegi Azadi, the Women Life Freedom Movement from 2022, which in many ways continues today as a broad-based civil society disobedience campaign. This was a very significant uprising that crossed geographical boundaries. It united the urbanized center with the periphery. It crossed ethnic boundaries, uniting the Persian majority with ethnic groups such as the Kurds, who were actually spearheading this protest movement. It crossed the boundaries of class in Iran, in a country where traditionally the big protest movements in the urban centers were spearheaded by the middle class. Here you actually had working class coming together with middle class across the country. This is a significant threat. I agree that there's an element of wishful thinking outside of Iran about this movement and its potentialities, and that the exile diaspora movement has tried to sort of blow it out of proportions, but it was nonetheless the biggest single threat to the Islamic Republic coming from inside Iran ever in the Islamic Republic's history. And just a final anecdote, if I may. We tend to focus then on the secularized Iranians as a threat to the regime, but even among religious Iranians, there is deep, deep, deep dissatisfaction with the Islamic Republic. We see this in the phenomenon of the madah, which is like the popular preachers in Iran. They are no longer necessarily government instruments. Some of them are actually very critical of the Islamic Republic, or at least of the government. There is also religious counter-currents, where you have sort of popular preachers outside of the theocracy, outside of the clerical power system, who are preaching another kind of Islam. For example, one of them being an anti-sectarian, maybe even anti-Shiite tendency. So you see a lot of tendencies inside Iran. So there's this paradox we need to take into consideration. There's the perception, partial reality of Iran being strong abroad, and then there's the fact of the Islamic Republic being weak at home. And I have to stop here.
Thank you so much. Let's give a hand. And now our next speaker is Dr. Sune Haugbølle, who is a professor in Global and Middle East Studies, political sociologist from Roskilde University, and one of his books he has recently authored with Rasmus Elling, which is on the fate of third worldism in the Middle East. And you have also written another book on war and memory in Lebanon, and the Arab Archive, which is another book yet. And recently, I think you're the PI of this research project on entangled histories of Palestine, and the global new left, and of course a lot of you might have seen Sune very actively in media lately, particularly since last year when the tragic events started.
Yeah, thank you, Mona. So I'll be speaking about Arab intellectuals, which is something that I've been researching and working on for many years, and I've been very curious about this debate in the Arab public about the war. And this is the first time I'm trying to sort of gather my thoughts about that and my observations. So the first comparison that people made just after October 7th was with the 1973 war, right? I think many of you remember that. This was a bit like Israel was taken by surprise, and this could change relations in the region and so on. But I think there's another comparison that's more interesting, which is to the 1967 war. So the Six-Day War was a major defeat for Arab nationalism and for Nasser. And in Arab intellectual history, it was a real turning point because many Arab intellectuals saw it as a sign of how the Arab culture and Arab political culture had failed. So there was a lot of reactions immediately afterward, actually, but also in the decade after that, that we can say was in reaction to this sort of turning point in history. And so I'm wondering, will Gaza 2023 be that kind of turning point for Arab intellectuals? And here I should be a little bit precise about what I mean with intellectuals. I mean, to some extent, everyone's an intellectual. Everyone's wondering, right, about what's going on in the world, and they have some conception and some ideas. But what I focus on is people who make slightly larger analyses and have a slightly broader reach in their thinking. So I'm looking at, and I'll talk to you about how Arabs have reacted to this war. And the first thing is really a lot of sadness, a lot of anger, of course, and a lot of documentation of what's been happening. And there, Palestinians have played a primary role. Some of the biggest, most important, I think, Arab intellectuals in this have been Palestinians. Mohammed al-Kurd, Diana al-Butto, people like that who have a voice in the international media, and especially in the US, have played a major role. But what I'll be talking about more is people who speak in Arabic to an Arab audience. And it's kind of quite difficult. And what since I don't have a lot of time, I'll try to make some outlines and give some examples of some of the tendencies that I see. I see some patterns, and they are patterns related to the first reactions that people had. As I said, there was horror, there was sadness, and that continues, but also a sense of a historical change right away. One side would react by saying this was to be expected. Israel had it coming, and although it's sad to see civilians being killed, this is a sign that they have overreached their limit in the Middle East, in the world in general, and there had to be a reaction like this. Others would say, well, this is not just a reaction against Israel, it's also a reaction against Arab regimes who did nothing to help the Palestinians, and so on. On the more sort of liberal side, I would say, of Arab intellectuals, there were people who would say, well, we feel a lot of sympathy with the Israeli victims, and this was a condemnable act, but at the same time, it's showing, just like the more sort of leftist would say, the liberals would also say, it's showing that there's been a failure of the world, of the West, and of the Arab regimes to resolve this. But perhaps there's also been a failure of our own regional system and of our politics. So it's partly to blame on us as well. And that's where I see some of the reminiscences of the 1967. There was a famous book in 1968 by the Syrian philosopher Sadiq al-Assam called Naqd al-Dati Ba'ad al-Hazima. It's sort of internal critique after the defeat. And there is a lot of that internal critique. I think not a lot of it is perhaps filtering through, so I'll talk a little bit about it to you. And give you some examples. So one point that's made in the intellectual debate is actually a reflections on intellectuals themselves. So this is intellectuals writing about intellectuals. And what they're writing is that we see a sidelining of Arab intellectuals. So they're saying, where the hell are the intellectuals? Intellectuals are not reacting enough. We don't have prominent intellectuals showing the way forward for Arab culture like we had in the 1950s and 1960s. We don't have these big leading voices anymore. So they're saying that sort of a bit about themselves, but also saying that that's because intellectuals have been silenced. So many so-called intellectuals are really working for the regimes. They have secured a place in society, but they don't have any critical voice, and that's why their voices now are insignificant, and they don't have anything to say about this. Others would disagree a little bit and say, well, there have actually been some good reactions. One of them was a collective letter of Arab intellectuals, and it was organized by the Syrian poet Adonis, whom some of you might know. He collected hundreds of Arab intellectuals in a letter published in November 2023. You could read it online. It was published in a number of Western newspapers as well. And it's really a cry against Israel and Israel's killings and the West's support for that. Basically saying it's an open letter to Western intellectuals, sort of the old school way of saying, you know, we are the intellectuals and we speak to other intellectuals. And I say it's a bit old school because it was a lot of old Arab intellectuals. And maybe the point is that those kind of intellectuals don't play that much of a role anymore. But anyway, the letter would say that this is condemnable. And you know, this was written in late November when we really started to see the extent of the killings of civilians. So of course people started to really react to that. And they were saying, join us, you Western intellectuals, join us in a joint struggle for universal values. You used to represent the values of the Enlightenment, of humanism, of international law. You need to step onto the scene now and criticize your own governments who are not criticizing Israel for what they're doing. So really, basically, a lot of the things that you're hearing in the protest movements as well was in this letter, and they were calling for Western intellectuals to join them. And you know, one of the people who didn't join that for sure was Habermas. Habermas wrote a long statement where he focused on the need to still warn against anti-Semitism and warn against the anti-liberal strains in those who defended Hamas and defended the Palestinians in general. So there was a lot of sort of tit for tat over that Habermas statement, also by other intellectuals in the region. Of course, there has been some support for Hamas as well from intellectuals. Open support for Hamas, who saying, well, they are now leading the struggle for justice in the region, and they had no choice. Palestinians had no choice; they had to react. They were cornered in the peace process, which is true, or the so-called peace process, and they had to hit back. And I would say that there, you know, that the support for that from official positions in Hezbollah, in Iran, in Syria. In the Houthi movement, that's the political axis of resistance, as we know. And I would say that someone like Hassan Nasrallah could be counted as a semi-intellectual voice. I listened to his speeches broadcast on Al-Manar, and there you have long, elaborate analyses. It's not just sort of flat slogans. It's quite interesting, actually, because he's making some detailed arguments that are being picked up on by some intellectuals. So I would say, if you look at the camp of leftist intellectuals in the region, they are split over Hamas and Hezbollah in general, and they have been for a long time. One part of the left would say, well, we don't support their Islamist values, but they're the only ones staging a fight, which is necessary still. Others would say, well, they have these big, strong, illiberal strains in them, and therefore we cannot support them even as leftists. But I would say there's part of the left intellectual camp has been leaning towards saying that the attack was necessary and justified. And there's more in that than just political strategy. It's also to say that the future of an Arab political and intellectual project has to necessarily involve an element of muqawama, of resistance, right? So sort of embracing resistance. And there, I want to give you a couple of examples of some of these sort of leftist voices. You can read them in Quds al-Arabi in particular, the pan-Arab newspaper. And Al Jazeera also have long opinion pieces and intellectual pieces on their online page where you can read some of these statements. Here is Ibrahim Mushara, who's an Algerian writer. He celebrates the letter of Adonis, and then sort of says that if there's any positive development coming from the Arab world, it will begin in Gaza. So the struggle is not just a struggle for Palestinian independence, it's for the future of the Arab countries and the Arab spirit and so on. So this is a citation that gives you a good sense of this line. The Arab tomorrow, which millions of Arab youths are waiting for, will only dawn from Gaza. The war in Gaza has revealed who is the true preacher, the honest intellectual, and the politician who does not trade in his nation's issues. The establishment of a Palestinian state with full rights is the guarantee for the demise of the authoritarian regimes and their superstructure. Right? So you have this idea that there is a structure. This is the Marxist idea. There's a structure, which is the authoritarian regimes, and then there's a superstructure of those intellectuals who just speak the regime speak. And this will all collapse. And the war in 2023 was the beginning of that collapse. So it's sort of back in a way to some of the things we heard during the Arab Spring, right? And the sort of echoes of that there's a regional order which is unjust. The West is supporting it. The West is talking about human rights and so on, but that's all BS. They don't mean it. If we're going to build a culture based on true human values and a future in the region, we have to bring down that order, right? Since I'm being asked to round up, I wanted to give you a few more examples of the leftist discourse, but I think you get that side. I want to also really stress that there's another discourse, which is a more liberal discourse, and you can read that in some Arab newspapers, more traditional here and there. The Arab liberals in general are quite defeated by the defeat of the Arab uprisings. Many of them are living abroad, and one of the things that happened after the Arab uprisings is that we got a number of new publications online, some of them funded by international media support and organizations like that, partly Danish money, that have given a platform for young Arab intellectuals to write. And there you can read some of the writings of these more liberal perspectives. One of them is Hossam Itani, who's a Lebanese writer. And I wanted to just give you a quotation from his article. It came out a couple of weeks ago in this online text, where he talks about the complete folly, first of all, of Hamas, saying what kind of weird ideology did they have that they could make these kind of miscalculations? Did they not know, first of all, that Israel would seize on this to completely destroy the Palestinian population? Secondly, did they not know that the whole region would not rise up? This was such a miscalculation. It just shows which kind of world they're living in of miscalculations. So it's an attack on the left in a way and their readings, but also a warning that the Gaza war has shown that the Arab world is in crisis, is in deep crisis, which is an intellectual crisis. And a crisis that will really only be broken when, again, back to the idea that the regimes have to be brought down, but not brought down by a false embrace of this kind of radicalism. So I see, intellectually, just to summarize, I see two big trends. One is a sort of a return to the Arab radical tradition of the need for confrontation and even armed confrontation. And on the other hand, a return to this kind of self-critique, which is a very deep tradition in the last 50 years in Arab intellectual culture. We have a lot of problems in Arab culture. We need to solve them. And embracing a military struggle is not the way, but we need to face some of our superstitions and some of our wrong and inhuman systems of governance, of treating each other in Arab societies as well. So it's not everything to blame on Israel or the West, it's also to blame on us. So the change has to come from inside. So those are some of the debates going on. There's a lot of other debates. One could talk about feminist debates and perspective. One could talk about a lot of really interesting voices from the youth, but first of all, also from Palestinians and Palestinian writers. There's so much going on, and I had 15 minutes, so I hope it's at least helpful to start a conversation about the intellectual side of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are almost, following the time line here, but our last speaker now is senior researcher here at DIIS, Lars Erslev Andersen, who in his daily work focus on U.S. Middle East policy, and since 2014, also on China's engagement in Iran and the Gulf states. His book on the conceptual history of U.S. security from the fall last year is soon to be published in English as Geopolitical Myths and the U.S. Quest for Unipolar Power, Civilization, Worldview, and Identity. And right now, Lars is writing a book on the cultural and historical background for U.S.-Israel close relations.
Thank you.
You have to turn on, the mic.
Now? Okay. Oh, I didn't turn it on. Okay, thank you. I will be shorter because some of the good presentations before me already touched on some of my points, and that's good because then we have more time for Q&A. I think it's interesting when I say we, it means US, Israel, Europe. It's the Western world are analyzing what's going on. We say, okay, we need to see the others. How are they doing? Iran, Palestinian, Hamas, the Arab states. But I think sometimes we also need to look at what are we doing and how are we doing. The analysis of the first approach is, the good results is a result of United States Middle East policy. And the bad result is results of bad people out there. And I think that maybe we have to balance that a little bit, or quite a lot actually. And that's what I just will focus on is on US and on Israel. First of all, US. Let remind you about the interviews with Jack Sullivan just the week before October 7. Said Middle East is more quiet than ever. Well, we can laugh about that, but he had some good points. Yeah, there were the rapprochement between Iran and the Arab states, and there was ceasefire going on in Yemen, and so on and so forth. But the fail was, or the mistake was, saying this was a result of the Abraham Accord. No, it was not. It was a result of the Gulf Arab being worried about the support from US, saying, okay, we need to do something ourselves. And China going into that, supporting that, ending up with the renewed diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So that was, I mean, the approach is something. If we do something in our shoots in New York, we can make a design of how to fix the Middle East. Now we should fix the Middle East with a new Abraham Accord between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But it won't work, and it won't be realized. We can talk about that. But it was not a result of the Abraham Accord. Israel, I listened to a book presentation by Benjamin Netanyahu in February last year. And say, okay, now we made this Abraham Accord. That shows that Israel is acting out of strength. And the more we act out of strength, the more we will gain. And then the Palestinians will need to find out that they are isolated and that they will need to agree to our terms of somehow a kind of resolution. I guess that he and Israel overestimated. Rasmus talked about the weak at home. Israel is also weak at home. If we see at the internal fragmentation of the Israeli society between Sephardi and Ashkenazi and not being able to find a stable government and all this. This is a problem that cannot be solved by showing strengths abroad. And then we have this situation now. I think we should also look at Israel. What will Israel do now? For me, I see two things. I see they have made a very this war in Gaza. But did they gain or did they obtain their goals? No. Will they obtain their goals? Probably not. What then when they come back and say, okay, we did that, but we didn't obtain anything else, then we lost recognition among the global south, among a lot of other countries. And we created a lot of anti-Semitism. So this is a situation that the government in Israel has to face. Well, but Israel is strong. It has deterrence. But the deterrence was somehow affected because, and Rasmus talked about that, because they attacked diplomatic house from Iran in Damascus. And Damascus, and this made the retaliation from Iran in very surprisingly way. And we can discuss how, and it is discussed. But among these 300 missiles, 9 reached the target. They were warned 72 hours before. Israel got the support from United States, from UK, from Jordan. They were having intelligence from Saudi Arabia, and UAE got the intelligence from Iran, supposedly warning Israel on what is going on, because the attack was not meant to be destroying anything. The attack was to send a warning. And it succeeded somehow. And now I guess that the military command and the leaders of Israel is sitting in their Jerusalem talking about it was not a good idea attacking this house in Damascus, because our deterrence is now deconstructed somehow. How can the reaction to be to repair this deterrence? It could be to draw the nuclear card. And how would that be? How would that resonate in the Arab world and in Iran? We already heard about Iran discussing changing its approach to the nuclear issue. Why will Saudi Arabia need to have nuclear civil power? That is one very, very important demand when they negotiate a treaty with the United States. A nuclear civil power program without restriction. Because they have good reasons for that, economic, politically, society could need that, but everybody know that it also is a platform for being able to build up the capacity for building nuclear weapons. So, and then how will Israel react when the goals, the war goals in Gaza didn't reach? How will they deal with the situation with more than 100,000 internal displaced persons from the border of Lebanon and from the border to Gaza? How will they react? This is, I think, something we need to think about. I think, if I must be provocative, that it looks like, if we only focus on Israel, that it is somehow a wounded bird, and we don't know how it will react to this situation. So this is something I think we need to think about. Concerning Dalia's, I think I agree on all points, but I would say that yes, the United States still present in the Middle East, still have all its bases, still have a lot of soldiers. It is a state with the biggest diplomatic corps in the world. It is still the state that gives most in aid programs to the Middle East, but politically it is declining, very much declining, and this has been going on for some years, and can come with a lot of examples, but I mean it increased. The decline increased during the Ukraine crisis. How can annexation be okay in Israel and Golan Heights, but cause sanction regimes and war in Ukraine and so on and so forth? So this is our problems. So that the political impact from the US and the designers of global strategy in the think tanks in Washington is their impact is declining, I would say. Can they repair that? Yeah. Can they, as a right in the national security strategy, be the leader of the rules-based world order? A lot of people that have watched U.S. performance during the Gaza war will say, no, I'm not convinced about that. We are not convinced about that. And this is a situation that we also need to take into the analysis of the broader impact of this Gaza war. And that was my word.
Thank you so much, Lars. And now we will actually move directly to the Q&A session, and I would like to invite all the speakers to come up to the stage. And I will just keep an eye after hands. You can raise your hands, and one of the students will come with a microphone. Do you want this one? And then I can take the other one. Okay, let's do that. Okay, we will start, I think, from the end. And when you just, again, the rules of the game here, when you pose a question, not comment, when you pose a question, then please introduce yourself and then try to keep it brief so that the panelists can elaborate also on their presentations, but also give you an elaborate answer.
So my name is Ignacy Białostocki. I want to ask you why in Danish media never mention the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar. He's a leader of Hamas who is fighting in Gaza. And I have never heard about the leaders. They call it only Palestinians. But Palestinians are people. They have leaders like Yahya Sinwar, Mashal or something. And the second question, what about the peace process? Mm-hmm. How you can get a peace process when Israel does not recognize Hamas and Hamas does not recognize Israel? So how can you make peace process? It is illusion.
Thank you so much. I think we will just lump together a couple of questions, and then I will give you the chance to comment on those. So yeah, we'll take.
Thank you so much. Jenny Hestermann, historian. Thank you all so much for your presentations. I have a question, a few, but I keep them short. To Rasmus, you were speaking about the fatwa of Khomeini. And my question is, to what extent do you believe in that? I heard of the fatwa for the first time, I have to admit, but given that like the 10, 15 last years, we are all occupied with Iran building a nuclear bomb, and now we are hearing, oh, but he is actually against it. Like, to what extent is that, can that be taken seriously or as rhetoric? And about the Arab intellectuals, I wonder, are there any that you might not have mentioned? Yes, you spoke about the liberals who kind of condemned the massacre of 7th of October, but were still putting it as a reaction into context. And to my knowledge, there are also Palestinians abroad, obviously in the US or UK, who are actively condemning more, to a much broader extent, the attack of the Hamas on Israeli civilians. So if you could also speak about that milieu, which I'm sure exists, as I know only a few of them, obviously. It's not my field. Yeah, and then also, like, maybe this, going back to the 1967 and the seeing it as a failure of their own political culture, to what extent is there a discussion of self-reflection of political culture of the Arab world maybe having failed now, given it has come to this point? And what Mona brought up about the normalization of Israel-Arab states, which didn't take a bum, act like a bum in the road, then one could also, the discussion about blaming the Arab states for normalization with Israel and not only the West, if there's any discussion on that.
Thank you so much. We'll take one more. We can take Fanny up here, and then.
Yeah, thank you very much. Briefly, I want you to perhaps elaborate on how the Gaza, or things happening in Gaza now, how it affects also the relationship between the states and the population. You talked about the Arab intellectuals, Sune, but also in different domestic, if it has any implications on that relationships. Some countries you see severe repression of Palestinian support protests. Some countries, they accept it. Do you see any implications on the state-society relations?
Thank you so much. There will be one more round. Yeah, you can just yes, there will be one more round, but a bit later. So I'll just say to our speakers that you can of course pick and choose, because there's so many questions, so you don't have to answer each of them, everyone. And I think I would like to start with the questions posed about the Hamas leader to you, Sune. And maybe also if some of you could reflect on the question about the peace process. I think that's a very relevant question to pose right now. Maybe from each of your perspectives, because you know, Lars, you were talking about the Abraham Accords, and there have been, you know, a little debate, I think, in the West also about, so what is actually a viable solution to this, and what are the debates among Arab intellectuals about the way forward. I think we should try to move to that space also. But please go ahead, Sune, you can start.
I mean, first of all, Yahya Sinwar has been mentioned in Danish media. Maybe you haven't heard it, but I know I have spoken about him and sort of given portraits and stuff like that. It's true that a peace process without recognition of Hamas is kind of impossible. That's the core of the problem, I suppose. I mean, if you look at the debate amongst Palestinians, it's very much about whether or how there can be a reconciliation between the different factions, in particular between Fatah and Hamas. So some people would say that Hamas has no future, and we have to recognize the Israeli claims and be realistic, and also looking at the outside world and how they look at Hamas. But others are saying, well, we have to be realistic and see that Hamas, or something like Hamas, you know, sort of a soft Islamism, Muqawama position, is going to still exist in Palestinian politics and society, also after the war. So that has to be part of a reunited Palestinian front. And without unification, nothing is possible. I mean, that's the one thing you really get from the internal Palestinian debate. Without some kind of unification, and you know, getting beyond that fracture that we've had since 2006 in Palestinian politics, Palestine and Palestinians will achieve nothing. The question about condemnation of Hamas amongst Palestinians and Arab intellectual, there's a lot of that. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of broad condemnation, but I don't think it's a problem to say yes, we condemn it, but we also see it as a symptom of something. I mean, that most people would say that. I think that's a quite reasonable position to have. The position you seem to be talking about is we fully condemn it, and there's no context, or I mean, that's. I think no one would sort of, unless I misunderstood you. Or maybe you want to restate your question, because
no, I think it's fine. Then we can move. Maybe Dalia, do you want to add?
Well, I'll just speak to the peace process and the whole Abraham Accords business. I think, you know, the idea of the normalization in theory is that, you know, it's supposed to lead to a path of reconciliation between Israel and Palestine as well. It obviously did not play out that way. It was unrealistic to begin with. The price was very low when it came to the UAE and Bahrain. All that was required at the time was for Israel to say we won't annex the territories. We have to remember the lead up of this in 2020. Now with October 7th, and before October 7th, when the Israel-Saudi issue was being discussed, there was even an interview with Netanyahu where he was basically saying, well, all they want is us to check the box. You know, the Saudis are not going to really want, they have to say it publicly, but privately, we know Mohammed bin Salman, you know, he wants this, he wants it for benefits he's going to get from Washington. As an American, I've been critical of the deal, not because I don't believe in Israeli integration in the region, but as an American, I'm asking what cost or what price are we paying, and have we thought about that cost benefit? But now I think October 7th, the price will be higher, and that is what we're hearing from the Saudis, is that you have language instead of a Palestinian component, that it needs to be the language being used now in the Arab world, very specifically, is a viable, irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state. So there is this idea that there needs to be more direct linkage between a future Palestinian state and broader Israeli normalization in the region. The issue is all of these things are being negotiated without Israelis or Palestinians, right? I mean, you have a government in Israel that is actively opposed to a two-state solution, not a minor detail, and you have a very fractured Palestinian leadership. So the Arab neighborhood, the Arab region, is also trying to work toward these unification questions. And even Arab states really adamantly opposed ideologically to Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood and so forth understand that you cannot ignore a significant element. So this is where I think we're going to see we already do see disconnect between close U.S. Arab partners who believe we need to think about how to unify the West Bank and Gaza. It needs to be a viable Palestinian state. And the U.S. position, which is closer to the Israeli position, which is there can be no Hamas in the future of a Palestinian state. And that's going to be, and my only thing is, I would say, think back to the Madrid process. We're very far from there. I'm not optimistic on resumption of a real peace process. We're very, very far. But back in the Madrid days, we do have to remember the PLO, you know, was the terrorist entity of the day, and they were not accepted. And they found workarounds in the Madrid Peace Conference, a joint Palestinian-Jordanian delegation, but backroom conversations with PLO represent. So if there's a will, there's a way. But as a governing authority, of course, and that's over. Hamas's days are over. But are there ways to integrate in the future? Possibly, but we are so far from that, I think, right now.
I just find it really interesting, very briefly, that the internal Palestinian and Arab debate about this is so different than the Western policy and media debate. Yeah. So most Arabs would say, well, this is a must, and it's likely going to happen, and we need to find a way towards it. And we don't hear that in the West very much.
Yeah, I would say I have heard of no peace negotiation or no peace process. I have heard about negotiations on ceasefire, and it didn't succeed. The reason, as I see it, is Israel will only have a ceasefire for a shorter term in order to have the hostages free. Hamas is not accepting that because they don't see any point in having a ceasefire and then releasing the hostages and then come back to the war. Neither Israel nor Hamas is in these negotiations on a ceasefire very much concerned about the victims in Gaza. I think it is basically for Netanyahu to win a total war, that is the elimination of Hamas. For Hamas, it is about Hamas. And this is why it go nowhere.
Thank you, Lars. Rasmus, there was a concrete question for you also.
I'll try to. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'll try to be brief. So the question of whether I believe Khamenei has given a fatwa about the Iranian bomb. There's a theological answer to this, and I won't go into the details, but it's basically a discussion of whether it's a fatwa or it's a hukm, which is a ruling, or if it's a hukm hukumati, which is a state decree. It is there because he constantly alludes to it, but you don't have it in written form anywhere. So there's allusions to the idea that he has made this fatwa, but that only, this is the problem with having a theocratic regime. You only listen to that fatwa if you also have him as your marja taqlid, which is like the spiritual head and not just the political head. As long as it's not a state decree, obviously other states can't really deal with that. There was an attempt, I think, from US side to sort of push the Iranians to say, so if there is a fatwa, then put it on paper as a state policy, and then we can negotiate in a different way. I don't. If the question of whether I believe Khamenei, I don't believe any politicians, and he's a politician. So of course he's not to be trusted in any way. But there is a fact that Iran doesn't need a bomb necessarily. Iran is now a threshold power. There's no debate to that. They can create a nuclear weapons program out of the legal. Peaceful nuclear energy program anytime, because they have reached a high degree of uranium enrichment capacity and also have a broad network of nuclear facilities that are not easy to turn out. So that's been a fact for a long time, but it becomes more pertinent now to discuss. Because again, what should keep Iran back from having that deterrent? It is a deterrent already to some extent, but certainly not in the way that North Korea has established itself.
Can I just ask you a follow-up question? How is peace discussed in Iran? Is there a vision for peace?
Very little in media. To be honest, I think very few Iranians actually discuss Palestine. If we talk about average, normal Iranians, it's my clear impression, and this has to be, it's just on my shoulders because it's anecdotal, and of course I'm not alone in this interpretation, but we don't have any hard data, but most Iranians, they don't care about Palestine. In fact, they are very tired of hearing about Palestine, and we know that during public demonstrations in Iran, a recurrent slogan is "Not Gaza, not Lebanon, Janam Fadai Iran," which means not Gaza, not Lebanon, my heart aches for Iran. Because they have the perception that the Islamic Republic is funneling oil wealth to finance wars outside of Iran instead of alleviating poverty and the economic crisis in Iran. So there's a broad sort of pushback against that. And I think the Islamic Republic is aware of this, so they're very strategic about how they signal this conflict. It's very much along the lines of Al-Mayadeen's coverage. It's basically like, let's see the Israelis, take some hits from this front. That's what we're interested in. The Palestinians are sort of a secondary. Apart from the fact that, of course, they propagandize this very much, and the murals and the state TV shows about Palestinian children and so on and so forth. But the generation who were themselves embedded in the Palestinian fight have either been eliminated by the Islamic Republic, they are either in prison or have been executed themselves or live in exile. The very few Islamists who were part of the Palestinian struggle in the sense that they went to Palestinian training camps in the 1970s are so few today. I think it's brutally honest to say that the Iranian sort of the power elite are just using Palestine as an excuse to legitimize their existence, basically.
Sune, you had a small comment, and then we'll take this second round.
It's just extremely interesting because what you're saying is similar to what Hossam Itani, the Lebanese liberal, was saying in his article. I didn't get to that, but he was saying basically most Arab peoples have other concerns than Palestine, and this is a big lie that Palestine can unite the people. There's a lot of anger out there, and this goes to your question, Fanny, so society-state relations. I'm not saying that Hossam Itani is completely correct, but it is true. If you look at Algeria and Morocco, they're almost at war, and people worry more about that than Palestine. The economic situation in Egypt, in Lebanon, is more on people's minds than Palestine. They're also angry about Palestine. So in Jordan and Egypt, for example, the regimes have attracted some anger for their seemingly sort of going along with Israel or not standing up to them, but not to the extent that we're about to see a popular revolution or anything like that. In Egypt, you've had boycotts of American restaurants, like quite a lot of boycotts actually, and demonstrations in Jordan that were hard to contain, but it's not a popular wave, and this is what Hamas were hoping. They thought it would be this Al-Aqsa hurricane, right, or flood wave, and that was the miscalculation. I think he's right about that, and that's because, yes, state-society relations are strained, but not at all like anything like an uprising on the way.
And I just add one thing, but the leaders, I completely agree with that, but leaders are, especially in Jordan and Egypt, they are worried about the protest, not because they think that may be the first concern, but that it will be used as a proxy to raise all the other issues that the Arab uprisings were about. And this is why you've seen them very quickly contain the protest, very worried about them morphing into something that's more about them and not about Palestine.
But on the other hand, people are also afraid of the state, right? So, and that's why the protests are not going any further. And you know, they do end up in prison in Egypt if they try. Yep.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of more questions. So one question here in the front row, second, third. Yeah, we have 3 questions there.
Hello, I'm Michelle Rasmussen from the Schiller Institute, and I want to ask a question about the a vision necessary for the peace process, a future vision, a unifying factor of the idea of peace through economic development for Lars or any of the other ones, about how you can move forward from this situation where there's so much hate and anger, and how you move forward. You have to have an idea. This is what we have created, the idea of the OASIS plan of peace through economic development, water development that can benefit the all sides. And I passed out a leaflet.
I think you posed your questions, so that's fine.
With
so
more
so
information
visions for
from
peace.
our seminar.
Yeah. Next question, the gentleman.
Thank you very much. I'm Klaus von Barnekow, former diplomat, and I have had the opportunity to live 3 years in Egypt. It's many years ago, but I can tell you one thing: the Egyptians didn't care very much about the Palestinians. And if I should follow in your trade, I would say that it could maybe, and there would be many Arabs today who think that it would be wonderful if, they would never say it, but if the Israelis would solve that problem once and for all. Now, Amon Oz, he once said that the big problem and the real catastrophe here is that both parties are right. Both parties are right. And a couple of you have mentioned that you will be provocative. I will be provocative. And I would say that if you knew anything about diplomatic negotiations and so on that took place, it wouldn't be very acceptable for the diplomats. You wouldn't know. You seem to, I mean, no one has mentioned it. And I would not ask you, why don't you mention what happened up to the Oslo process?
Thank you. So that's the question.
Because no one knew about it. It just came as a shock. And diplomacy is taking place among diplomats, not in papers and not among researchers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And one more question there. And do we have other burning questions? No.
My name is Ole Gerstrom. I'm a former politician here in Denmark. Regarding the massacre of October 7th, we had a correspondent from Berlingske Tidende on the spot when it happened, and he reported that it took 6 or 7 hours from the massacre until the IDF arrived. Nothing happened. They were allowed to slaughter people. And one wonder if this has to do with the Israeli government really wanted the Hamas to be strong, because they want a strong, difficult partner to come up against the PA to avoid getting a two-state solution. And we know that
So the
the
question
Israeli
is-
government arranged that Qatar has been financing the Hamas with $30 million a month for several years. You know that?
So you can see if you can find the questions in there. But I think now we are running out of time actually, so you would have the chance to say your final points here. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but we have listened to very interesting presentations today. So I think we should maybe start from you, Christine, and then we can end with Lars. Yeah. Okay, then Rasmus.
I also don't think I have anything to add, at least not to the points raised here.
But you're also welcome to come back to some of the points the other panelists raised, if you want to. You can think a bit. So, you go
Maybe
ahead.
just
Yes,
to
sir.
the last gentleman. I mean, as you probably know, there's a big investigation about what actually happened on the 7th of October. And I think, the most interesting investigation and debate is the one in Israel. So there's a lot of critical perspectives also about the participation of the Israeli army itself in parts of the killing. And that could maybe end up in sort of a change a little bit in the numbers of who was actually civilians, who was actually killed by Hamas. And this feeds into the debate about Hamas's intentions going into this. And maybe also the intentions of those who supported Hamas. That's also what you're alluding to. Was there sort of a plan? Was Iran involved? Was Qatar somehow involved? Was Netanyahu somehow involved? I mean, this is a lot of speculation. I think we need some more hard evidence before we say anything conclusive. But it's important, of course, and it's okay to speculate.
Well,
Yeah.
no,
So the Israeli
yeah.
press is a great place to follow this.
Yeah. Well, no, picking up on that, I would just say that it actually, the speculation, of course, would be on motivations, but it isn't speculation, it's fact, and it's public in Israeli press and other places, that Netanyahu did support the division of the Palestinian entity and did a green light through back channels the Qatari support to Hamas because he was opposed to a two-state solution. But I think, of course, the horrific attacks on the 7th, no Israeli, even Netanyahu, I think that's real speculation, assuming that motive. But what I think the lesson here is catastrophic miscalculation because of overconfidence. And I think that's the storyline, is this idea that we can keep containing the conflict because we're Israel, we're strong, because no one cares about Palestine anymore, because there's been a decade of civil wars and half of Syria is displaced. And, Palestinians are a footnote and we're strong and we're going to get away with it. And so there's overconfidence. Overconfidence leads to real catastrophe. And so it was real miscalculation. And I would add, in the Israel-Iran sphere, Rasmus, I really liked and I follow that quite a bit myself, and have written about it, and I completely agree, unprecedented. But actually, it wasn't so unprecedented. What Iran did to Israel was unprecedented. 300 missiles announced, direct. But Israel attacking Iran, and by the way, they didn't take credit for it, so it wasn't that different than previous. It was different in that it was in this tit for tat that was unusual. But Israel's been attacking Iran for over a decade, and actually in recent years, very frequently. It just had an attack last February in this location in Iran itself. It's been killing IRGC generals all over the place in Syria. What Israel did was it miscalculated again, overconfidence, thinking Iran is weak domestically. Iran's hands are tied. We have the upper hand here. We can keep doing this. U.S. has our back. Look what we're getting. And we can keep doing this. The Israelis, the security and intel people that I talked to, they miscalculated and they acknowledge it. They did not expect that reaction, and now they are likely rethinking, and we don't know what's going to be next. So I think the lesson to me as a conclusion is that we need to be really careful of assuming that we know what actors are exactly thinking, but there's a lot of risks in when players on the ground, even if we can come up with all the rational reasons why nobody would want a war to expand, nobody would want to or expect this attack, it can still happen. Because surprises happen when you don't read the other side correctly.
Thank you so much, Lars. Are you good? Okay, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the panelists for coming.